Hi, thank you so much for watching our webinar, Language Learning Benefits and Trends. This webinar is provided by Sponge Language School. Sponge is founded in 2005, offering immersion-based language classes throughout the greater Seattle area. We are very delighted to introduce today's guest speaker, Sue Brooks and Erica Titus. Sue Brooks is an educator with a huge commitment to dual language learning, a trilingual speaker and a PhD candidate. She ran a Mandarin and English school in Shanghai for 9 years before moving back to the US in 2016. She's planning to open a new international French school in Central District, offering Mandarin and Spanish immersion program. Today she'll be talking about a quick overview of benefits of bilingual education. Next, Erica Titus. Erica leads curriculum development at Sponge. A heritage French speaker with a master's degree in French language teaching, she is an experienced language teacher and passionate about language education. She'll be talking about trends in language learning, ways to support language development. All right, then let's get started.
Hi everyone, my name is Sue Brooks, as Natsumi said, and I'm really pleased to have you join this webinar with us today. So as a parent, a long-term expatriate, and also as an educator, I really am passionate about dual language learning. And I feel that the hard benefits, like the high academic achievement, are really on equal par of importance with those of the soft benefits, like greater attention to task and the better ability to understand the perspective of the speaker. Language is a vehicle to culture, and it is such a useful bridge to cross to understand other people, their ideas, their holidays, their belief systems. Children are in a position to integrate and explore ideas that will probably be different than their own in so many ways. This is really good stuff. So as just mentioned, I'm so committed to this that I'm opening my own school, which is a Friends Quaker school, and we're only going to offer dual language Mandarin and Spanish. And we begin with those beautiful early receptive brains in the fall of this year with 3- and 4-year-olds. And personally, as an educator, I really feel that it sends such a powerful social justice message, that there's great equity built into programs where there's not just one language or culture that is valued over the others. So children begin to understand that there's two ways to look at things. Now, let's have a really quick look at what is coming your way in this webinar. I'm going to really briefly touch upon basic terminology, common methodology, and then we're going to jump into some of the current research. And the different areas of contemporary research are executive functioning, academic benefits, diversity, cultural competency, cognitive health in old age. This is really new research. And my very favorite, which are the social benefits. And then I'm going to wrap it up and turn it over to Erica. So let's start by talking about basic terminology. So instruction in language learning refers to a small portion of the day or the week that a student of any age is learning that target language. So for example, this is like high school Spanish, remember? Or 2 hours per week after school in a program in your classroom, or your mom got you a tutor in French. So this type of tutoring and instruction and awesome services like Sponge you're offering are under this model. Now, immersion is different. Immersion refers to a large or significant portion of the day that the student of any age is learning in and about the target language. So the target language becomes the vehicle through which the child learns core content like math and science, as well as literacy in both languages. So many early childhood programs offer full or almost full immersion because the brain is at its most receptive peak. In my own program, we do 70% in Mandarin or Spanish and 30% in English. But you may find 80-20 or 50-50. Generally speaking, by 3rd grade, the languages tend to balance out to be 50-50 so that that child can gradually accomplish biliteracy. So let's talk about what you probably hear very often is two-way immersion. So this is when you're going to have two majority groups of students. One group will enter the program as monolingual speakers in the target language. So let's say that they are recently arrived from China and they're only speaking Mandarin in their home environment. So we would call these heritage speakers. Your second group would also be monolingual speakers, but they're only going to speak English. So then you're going to have the kids that are right in between on this spectrum. So for example, Rosa might speak Spanish at home and William speaks English at home, but in the classroom, there's two ways then for each of them that the language is being integrated depending on the recipient. So the goal for a program like this is extremely high levels of biculturalism, bilingualism, biliteracy, and academic achievement in both languages. And you also want to see great language equity in classrooms in this type of program. Like I love going to schools and seeing how the Spanish signs are on top of the English signs, or the principal is delivering a message and she'll start it with Mandarin and then do English, and then she'll change it over the next day. So there's a wonderful balance and equality in how the languages are represented. Now, you probably have also heard about one-way immersion. Now, this is when all the kids are monolingual target language speakers, or all the kids are monolingual English speakers. So this is when you're going to have a class of kids that all speak English at home, and the one-way immersion is that now they're in a Spanish immersion classroom. It's also called late exit or simultaneous bilinguals. Okay, let's go into methodology. So ideally, you want to see a student in a program of at least 6 years, in either this two-way or this one-way. And there are so many different ways to do this. And in fact, if you research on your own, you won't find one way that's more dominant than the other. Like many schools will choose their core content subjects like math and science and music, and these will always be in the target language of Mandarin, Spanish, or what have you. And then part of the day is also spent learning literacy skills in the target language. So if you're learning math and Mandarin, you're also going to have a Mandarin class to help you write characters and to understand how to speak Mandarin. Some schools do like one whole morning and then the afternoon is flipped and then they change it out the next day, or there's certain teachers that just maintain true to that certain language. There isn't a real general way to do this. And it's interesting how some schools are some methodology is working for some schools, but for others, maybe not so much. What you don't want to see, and what you see often in these programs, is a teacher who breaks the rules. So she's telling that child who's been in that class for 3 weeks, 你真的不能用洗手间. And then she looks at him and goes, hey, that means you can't use the bathroom right now. Because what happens then is the kids totally figure out that they can wait, and that translation will come to them eventually. So we are going to jump into the current research, and I will just put the caveat out there, like any kind of research is about connecting dots. I try as a PhD candidate to look at how research relates to other research, and so I'm trying to put together an aggregate for you so that you can make sense of some of the research that's out there. So in the words of Gigi Look, who's an associate professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, bilingualism is an experience that shapes our brain for a lifetime. So what do we know about bilingualism? Well, much of what we once thought we knew, that speaking two languages is too confusing for children, that they must compromise native language literacy, and that it poses cognitive challenge best avoided, these are now known to be inaccurate. Today, bilingualism is often seen as a brain-sharpening benefit, a condition that can both protect and preserve cognitive functioning well into old age. So let's jump in. We're going to start with executive functioning. This part's a little bit long, so if you do want to take notes, this is a really good time. Now, one of my favorite researchers is Ellen Bialstock. She's a professor at York University in Toronto, and she's a leading researcher in the field of bilingualism. And she describes this constant selecting process between languages as being really serious work for the brain. And it involves processes beyond those required for monolingual speech. So you get like this extra stash of mental acuity, or in Bialstock's terms, a cognitive reserve. I like to think of it as a really intense CrossFit training for the brain. Because as bilingual children toggle between two languages, they're going to need cognitive resources beyond those required for simple language acquisition in a single language. So recent research has shown that bilingual children outperform monolingual children on tasks that tap directly into executive functioning. Skills having to do with attention control, reasoning, and flexible problem solving. It turns out that in most ways, the real trick to speaking two languages consists in managing not to speak one of those languages at a given moment, which is fundamentally a feat of paying really close attention. So saying goodbye to mom, or zaijian to your teacher, or asking for a red crayon or a Crayola Roja or skills called inhibition and task switching. Bilinguals pay focused attention without being distracted and also improving the ability to switch from one task to another. So think of conflict inhibition as the ability to disregard the rules that you've learned about one language. Now, this is obvious in the context of language because you need to be able to forget a grammar rule in one language to construct a sentence in another. It's like this constant system of checks and balances and code switching at a very cognitive level. And the researchers, Christina Crivello of Concordia University in Montreal, she found that conflict inhibition also applies and extends into non-language tasks. And this is where research gets really exciting. So in one of my favorite studies, they looked at reverse categorization. So children were told to put a set of little blocks into a little bucket and big blocks into a big bucket. And then the instructions were switched. So now you put the big blocks in the little bucket and the little blocks in the big bucket. And these are monolingual English speakers receiving instructions in English. Now, children as young as 3 or 4 were able to interpret the researchers' new directions much quicker than monolingual speakers. So this suggests a process of discernment. Now, because bilinguals may acquire 2 languages in the time in which monolinguals acquire 1, they really become just flexible learners. The speed and apparent ease with which young infants learn the basics of a language always astound parents and scientists alike. They use the best of their brain when they're learning more than one language at a time, and they don't even know it. I mean, these children that speak Mandarin, Swedish, and English by the age of 3, it's a feat that boggles the adult mind, but for children, it can be relatively effortless. Increase listening skills, and I love seeing this in my classrooms, because as children begin to tune their hearing to learn unfamiliar sounds and words in the new language, their listening skills develop. They have to develop because language becomes a very important function for getting through your day. If you need to ask for the bathroom in Mandarin, you will do your very best to form that sentence. It's really similar to a musician having a trained ear for the sounds of notes over time. Children in their first 5 years, their job is to achieve oracy, listening and speaking, in order to best function in their worlds. Now, you probably know this, but babies hear their mother's voices before birth, and as newborns, they already understand the rhythms and cadences of their native language. So once born, they actually can detect, these are newborns, differences in languages. So bilingual education leads to an increase in what we call meta-linguistic awareness. You understand in a really clear way how languages are put together. So if you learn 2 languages, learning that third is going to be a whole lot easier for you. So studies have shown that this increase in the ability to listen also decreases distractibility, as the brain is trained to listen in order to function well in a bilingual environment. High memory retention. This is another additive benefit. So as children memorize new words, they're actually helping their brain to be better at memory work in the future. So how does that work? Well, as you stimulate the brain with difficult new challenges, you're working it out, thus giving the brain a boost in overall health, vitality, and an increase in memory power. This is true of children that learn an instrument at a young age as well. So some interesting studies have been done on the neurology of the brain. And Dr. Andrea Michelli from the University College of London just published her team's research to show that the gray matter density in scans of the left brain were greater in bilinguals than in monolinguals. The brain's left side is responsible for processing information and controlling aspects of sensory perception, memory, and speech. She found that this increase was most significant in children who had learned a foreign language before the age of 5. So when we talk about cognitive flexibility, we're referring to the idea that both languages are active, even though one of them is being used. And I think this is such an interesting concept for you to grasp, that by speaking one language, the other language remains completely an active part of the system. It isn't a skill that is implemented when it's needed. They both stay on fire all the time. So thanks for staying with me for that part. Let's move on to academic benefits. Research here started, about 15 years ago, and it started to make sure that public schools could figure out if indeed they should keep these dual language immersion programs. So let's look at Portland, Oregon. About 10% of the students in Portland are assigned to public schools by lottery to dual language classrooms, and they offer instruction Spanish, Japanese, Mandarin alongside English. They really are true leaders in the field when it comes to public education. So Jennifer Steele at the American University conducted a 4-year randomized trial, and she found that these dual language students outperformed their peers in English reading skills by a full year's worth of learning by the end of middle school. Okay, so I'm just going to rephrase that for you. So children in the bilingual program who are native English speakers at home tested higher in English literacy by the end of middle school. So in another study, 2014 by Stanford University, they looked at San Francisco's Unified School District's bilingual program. And they showed that the English native speakers in a bilingual program had equal fluency in English as opposed to those kids in English-only classrooms. So we do see variations in the research, of course, but there's a lot of studies involved in academic benefits, and they all support the premise that you're not going to lose anything in your native language. And in fact, what you're probably going to gain is extra knowledge in English literacy. So by the time they reached the 5th grade, the English language learners in San Francisco's public schools were equally proficient in English. There was nothing lost. In terms of subjects like math or science scores between monolinguals and bilinguals, there doesn't tend to be much of a difference. The concepts transfer really easily when you think about it. A lot of the time, what you want to focus on as educators is learning that vocabulary in both languages. The concept of the water cycle is going to transfer regardless, because these are things you need to understand. So whether you're learning the word for rain in Mandarin, which is xiaoyu, or in English rain, or in Spanish lluvia, you're still going to understand what rain means. So in studies covering 6 states and 37 districts, my favorite researchers, seminal researchers, Wayne and Collier, have found that compared with students in English-only classrooms, dual language students have somewhat higher test scores across the board, and also just seem to be happier in school. Like their attendance is better, behavioral problems are fewer, they're seeing less cases of ADHD, and parent involvement tends to be higher. So again, I just want to say a point that I made earlier, that the value of having your home language validated, it probably makes you that much more interested in going to school. So let's look at diversity and integration. American public school classrooms are as a whole becoming more segregated by race and class. And dual language programs can be an exception to this. Because they're composed of native English speakers deliberately placed together with often recent immigrants, they tend to be more ethnically and socioeconomically balanced. And there is some evidence that this helps kids of all backgrounds gain comfort with diversity and different cultures. It can also help improve students' sense of belonging and increase parent involvement in their children's education, including behaviors like reading to kids. Many parents fear their language is an obstacle. It's a problem. And if they abandon it, their child will integrate better, says Antonella Cerasi from the University of Edinburgh. We tell them that not doing their child a favor by giving up their language. So think of all the wonderful and clever ways that schools can integrate customs from other countries. And it's so fun, like having someone's abuela, grandmother, come and make cascarones, which are eggs filled with confetti that kids absolutely love, or having a colored body paint party for Holi, or having an extremely loud Chinese New Year parade to chase away evil spirits. These are very culturally awakening experience for kids. So, and also there's all this talk of 21st century skills. Well, global competency is very high on that list of skills. And it can begin right here with 5-year-olds in a dual language, bicultural classroom. There's a lot of recent research about the protection against cognitive decline and dementia. So you can file bilingualism away as a very, very long-range payoff. Researchers have found that actively using those 2 languages seem to create a protective effect against age-related dementia, perhaps relating to the changes in brain structure that we talked about earlier. So researchers using behavioral and neuroimaging methods examine the effects of bilingualism on cognition in adulthood and to explore possible mechanisms for these effects. And this research shows that bilingualism has a somewhat muted effect in adulthood, so they're not seeing much difference between the 30s and 40 years old, but as this brain ages, there's a much more significant what's called cognitive reserve that's evident. Cognitive reserve is a crucial research area in the context of an aging population. So as predicted, the bilinguals in old age hang on to greater frontal lobe white matter compared with monolinguals. And moreover, increasing age was related to decreasing temporal cortical thickness. I know this is very sciencey in the monolingual group, but no such relationship was observed for bilinguals. Okay, guys, let's move on to my very favorite area of research, better social skills. And there's a lot of recent profound research about this. Two studies in particular I want to bring up to you. Researchers took a group of children in the United States, ages 4 to 6, from different linguistic backgrounds, and presented them with a situation in which they had to consider the researcher's perspective in order to understand their meaning. And they found that bilingual children were much better than monolingual children at this task. And if you think about it, it makes intuitive sense. Interpreting someone else's meaning often requires attending not just to the content, but what is the researcher actually seeing? What do you want to understand about that perspective? What does the speaker know and not know? And what does she intend to convey? Children in bilingual environments have social experiences that provide routine practice in considering the perspectives at others. And they're usually better at expressing themselves and at adapting to new situations. And speaking from the heart, I really love how groovy my own children are with their Mandarin. They've gotten so many internships because people can tell that they're agile. You can send them anywhere in the world and they're just going to figure things out. And they feel a sense of belonging in the world. Now, let's very quickly take a look at where are the bilingual programs in the U.S. now. New York City leads the way with over 28 immersion programs. Portland is next, followed by Utah, Minnesota, California, Texas, North Carolina. And in these places, they're growing faster than any other type of program. Now, in the United States, only 20% of people are bilingual, compared to 35% in Canada and 65% in Europe. Now, Seattle itself has got some great public schools that are offering bilingual programs: Dearborn International, Mandarin Spanish; Beacon Hill, Mandarin Spanish; Stanford School, Japanese, Russian Spanish, and there's a plethora of options in Bellevue and an awesome French-American school on Mercer Island. Options also bound for preschools in King County. But certainly don't get hung up if you can't make the commitment to enroll your child in an immersion program altogether. Schools like Sponge offer really great ways for kids to be exposed in meaningful ways to a second language. So my advice to you as a parent, as an educator, is just jump in. The advantages are brilliant. And as discussions continue on 21st century skills that students now need to acquire, I'm going to toss in that becoming a bilingual learner increases a child's sense of global citizenry and global consciousness. So if this new purpose is to empower all students to become active and agile global citizens, then we can and should elevate our aspirations of what it means to educate children for new complexities in an increasingly connected world by giving them yet another skill for them to use. The language proficiency and cultural competency that are the genuine, authentic gifts of the bilingual brain. Now, if you want to check out more websites, I really love this one, which is the miparentscouncil.org. She's a parent who enrolled her kids in Mandarin immersion. She's also a journalist based in San Francisco, and she has got so much research on here. The Washington Association for Bilingual Educators has got a lot of different websites that they'll direct you to in terms of schools and research. The National Association for Bilingual Education is, of course, the big sort of national heavyweight. And if you're a parent with little kids, you should check out the National Network for Early Language Learning. They've got so many resources. And the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, ACFL, is really, really valuable for both educators and for researchers and for parents. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I'm really sorry if it felt like a lot of information, but I so hope that you're able to take away a really positive view of bilingual learning. Erica.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was so much great information.
You bet.
Hi guys, I'm Erica and I work with curriculum development here at Sponge, and I'm a heritage French speaker. So, Sue was talking about all these great immersion education programs around the country. In Louisiana, we have a program too. It's not quite as big as other states, but we have about 30 schools, maybe more now, that do language and dual immersion programs. So it's all really exciting stuff. So just to recap real quick, what Sue was talking about, the benefits of language learning, she gave so much information, so much wonderful information, but let's just summarize it together. So there's really three main areas of benefits to language learning that Sue identified. We have our cognitive benefits, everything that Sue was talking about in terms of like your improved attention span, your metalinguistic abilities, divergent thinking, improved problem solving, and spatial logic skills, surprisingly. And the offset of age-related diseases, of course, is a new area and a really exciting one. And then there's academic success. We find that bilingual students have higher performance on standardized tests. They have better linguistic awareness in elementary age children, which is what Sue was talking about, that metalinguistic awareness. They're just aware of language being a system of, codes instead of just being something innate to life. They see it as something that's built and constructed. It can help with reading in their native language, print awareness, so the connection of physical letters to sounds and words in young children, and there's skills transfer too. Sue was talking about math and science, and there's one study that I really love that shows that bilingual students did better in science because they were able to more creatively hypothesize outcomes for science experiments. So that's a really fun one, and I have some resource pages later that actually have links to that article if you're curious about it. And then there's the attitudes towards others, those social skills and 21st century skills and being a global citizen Sue was talking about. So these are all the amazing benefits we can get from language learning. Now, do you think that you only get these benefits if you're in a dual language immersion school or something like that? Of course not. As Sue said, if you can take instruction classes like Sponge, and Sponge offers what we call immersion-based classes. So what we mean by that is, while we are instructional classes that only happen once or twice a week, we do use the immersion method wherein our teachers only speak the target language to the children. So it's kind of like a little bit of blending these methodologies together. So you do not have to be in a dual immersion school to get these benefits of language learning. I kind of like to use the bicycle metaphor. If you have a bike with one wheel, you only speak one language, a unicycle, you're not going to get quite as far as if you have a bike with two wheels. Now, having two perfectly formed equal-sized wheels is the best in, the best case scenario. You're going to go much further, much more quickly. But even having one of those old-fashioned bicycles with a big front wheel and a little back one is still a little easier to ride than a unicycle. So even having a little bit of a second language can help with all of these different areas, just not maybe quite as to the same degree as full immersion. So let's look at some trends now in language learning. So what I love about this graph is that it shows not only the number of native speakers, but the total number of speakers, including people who speak it as a second language. So when we look at this, we can see that a language like Mandarin has about 873 million native speakers. But when you look at people who speak that as a second language, we suddenly jump up to 1.3 billion total speakers. And the same thing happens with English. You see, English is way far down, not way far down, it's number 4 on the list, with 328 million native speakers. However, 1.8 billion total speakers. So there's a much bigger gap there between the number of native speakers and people who speak it now as a second language. Now they're considering second language people who speak from birth, English and another language. They're considering the language you speak in your home as your first language for this, the purposes of this graph. Most graphs you see that show the world will include the total speakers, not just the native speakers. So I think this is really interesting. We can see the languages that are really popular and the languages that are really popular to learn. So obviously English, really popular to learn. Look at the discrepancy there. But then look at Spanish. There's a lot more total speakers than there are just native speakers. And the same with Mandarin, we see that pretty big gap. But if we look over at a language, even like Japanese, we have 126 million native speakers and only about 130 million total speakers. And we can kind of see these trends reflected in everyday life and in language schools and education. So if we go to the next graph, you can kind of see a local perspective. I don't have all the numbers for the Puget Sound region, but I can give you some insights into Sponge and what trends we see. For preschool, we can see that Spanish is generally growing year after year. That is the darker, the green bar at the very top, and this is a total percent of the students we have. So you can see that this year, about almost 40% of all of our students are Spanish students here at Sponge in preschool. And then Japanese and French are generally stable with some ups and downs over the years. And Mandarin was the most popular language 4 or 5 years ago, but it's declined in popularity versus Spanish, but it still remains a very popular language. And then if we look at this one, we can see our elementary level school trends for language for Sponge. And Spanish has been the most popular over the years, and we certainly see this in all the new requests that we get from schools moving forward. And French seems to be gaining some popularity again after decline a few years ago. Mandarin remains relatively stable. It goes through ups and downs, but it never goes away. So you can see that these world trends and world popularity languages do reflect back on the languages that are popular. And, you know, it's hard to make a choice sometimes about which language to study. And you can see that Mandarin has a lot of speakers, so maybe that's a language you might want to choose, but maybe not. So, but then the question kind of comes up, well, why is French so popular? Comparatively to the other languages, it didn't seem to have quite as many native speakers and second language speakers. And some of the reasons for this, you know, it's the official language of the International Olympic Committee, it's the official language of the UN, it's the official language of the World Health Organization, French is, and many other international organizations, so it remains politically and diplomatically a very important language. And then I read something interesting the other day about population growth in Africa. And French is one of the most popular second languages in Africa, and population there is expected to grow exponentially in the next, few decades. So we can expect to see French regaining popularity and among the population of the world. All right, so at the end of all of this is really to say that language learning is popular and for a good reason. It connects us with the rest of the world. It gives us an ability to be global citizens. And even if you can't afford classes, to go to full immersion classes and dual language schools, a lot of them are private, not all of them. There's many public. If you don't happen to get in the lottery, there's lots of other ways that you can support language learning. Obviously, the very best choice, like we just said, is dual language or immersion-based schooling. But sometimes those aren't in your area, or they're hard to get into, or they're expensive. So what are some other things you can do? You can take language classes, of course. Just like what Sponge offers. We have after-school classes, weekend classes, daytime classes for preschool children. This type of thing helps a lot. Even a little bit of exposure at early age can lead to literacy and bilingualism later. And then if you can't find any of those in the area, there's language clubs and enrichment classes. There's online classes. Sponge is hoping to pretty soon be expanding into some online live classes. There's all kinds of fun things you can do in your local community. For example, if you have friends or family that speak another language, use them as a resource, explore that language. You have a connection to it. You have a sense of identity there. And then, go on some local parenting blogs and things, and you might be surprised to find some play groups or language groups in your area that meet up and practice in a certain language, or where all the moms or dads are native speakers of one language. And then there's your community events, So in a community like Seattle, you go to the seattlecenters.com's calendar of events, you'll see there's all kinds of fun language and culture-related events happening all year round that you can go ahead and get involved in. Sometimes it's hard to know if you're choosing the right kind of a program, if it meets the right criteria, if it's a good program or not. And if you're curious, you can email us here at Sponge, and we can help you by sending you some criteria you might want to use when selecting a program. So there's even more ways to support language learning. Sometimes you don't have access to classes, you don't have money for online tutoring, you don't have family. So what you can do at home or your local library, there's YouTube videos, songs, apps, games you can get. You don't have to speak the language to start share a language with your child. Here are some helpful links at our Sponge website. We have links for French, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, German, and Hindi, all the languages we teach. And these are great resources. There are books, there's YouTube videos, songs, apps, games, everything you can imagine. So please feel free to check that out. And then as Sue showed you some resources earlier, and I just have a couple more for you here. Sue mentioned ACTFL, the American Council in Teaching Foreign Languages, and I here have a link to a specific page on their website, the Advocacy and What Research Shows page. It has an annotated bibliography for all 3 areas that I pointed out related to language learning, and great explanations of the research articles, because sometimes they're a little dense and difficult to get through. And then finally, you can go to our Sponge research page, spongeschool.com/language learning, and we have links to many resources there, such as critical period research. This is the idea that the easiest time to learn a language is between birth and age 5 or 6. But does that mean that adults can't learn a language? Of course not. Anyone can learn. We also have some immersion research and some research on the benefits of bilingualism. Okay, I think that's about it for our webinar. If you have any questions, please email us at info@spongeschool.com and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Or feel free to explore our website at spongeschool.com. I think we'd love to take some questions.
All right. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Eric and Sue. I really appreciate it. So I have 3 questions. How can I manage my expectation about learning another language?
Well, I think as a parent, it's really careful. You have to be careful managing your expectations if your child is enrolled in language learning, because it's a process that simply takes time. And here's an anecdote for you. At my school in Shanghai, there was a little girl that started named Lotta, who was 4, who only spoke Swedish her whole life, which was 3 years. And so she was enrolled in our program in Mandarin and English, and a month into class, her parents took her to a Chinese restaurant and came back the next day absolutely furious because their daughter wasn't ordering dinner in Mandarin. So, you know, you just have to have a sense that it is a process for this child. And if you don't speak that language that you expect your child to learn, then it's kind of like learning in a vacuum. So you do need to give it some time. And sure enough, 5 months to the day that she started, Lotta turned to one of her teachers in snack time and said, you know, 请你给我还有一个饼干, and we were all just sort of floored. So this is the type of learner that wants to wait and get it perfect, where some kids may just start jumping in right away. But yeah, manage your expectations. It's really, really important. Your child needs your support, and role model what it's like to learn a language. You know, ask them some questions that maybe, you know, they may be able to help you with things that they've learned about this language. Give it validated and give it something of great value for them.
Yeah, and I just kind of adding to that, you know, one kind of rule of thumb way to think about it is that an infant hears a language for 700, 720, 740 hours almost before they start uttering their first words, you know, mama, dada, no, maybe. So, you know, if you think about it in those terms, it takes an infant 700 hours to get comfortable enough with the language to start using it. It's not as simple as that, because infants also have development of their vocal cords and that sort of thing. But, you know, that's kind of a nice way to think about it. It's going to take time. It takes time to learn a language. You absorb it first before you start producing it. And then another thing I just want to point out real quick is that translation isn't the same as spontaneous language use or authentic contextual language use. So asking your child to translate something like, oh, this is an apple, what is this in Mandarin, is not the same as them being in a natural environment where Mandarin is a language they're using and asking for the apple.
Good point.
Yeah. And another question, how should kids choose what language to learn? What do you think?
So this is a hard question.
It's difficult, but you are a French heritage speaker.
Yes, so it was easy for me to choose, you know. My great-grandparents all spoke French. French is a part of my history. And so I think that's a good place to start. If there's a language that's part of your history, that has a lot to do with your child's identity, not just yours or your grandparents, but also that child's. So I think that's a good place to start. You could also look at what languages are popular if you're trying to set your child up for future potentially academic or economic success. But I think the best way to go is to kind of think about what you want out of this and what your child wants too. If they're a little older, you can ask them. You know, they might have a lot to say about it. What do you think, Sue?
Well, I think there's different ways to look at it. I learned Mandarin when I was 10, and growing up, I'd heard Nepalese and Cantonese. So a lot of it depends too, as parents, when you think about it in America, by the year 2050, 50% of the population of this country will be people of color. So, you have to have some sense of how do you project into the future your child and where geographically would you like them oriented? If they learn Mandarin proficiently for 6 to 9 years through middle school, then they will probably be traveling to Taiwan or China. They will probably be looking at companies like Alibaba to do their internship with, because this is a skill that they can now apply. So I think you have to look at it like a kaleidoscope and keep turning it to make the decision on what's going to settle best for you. I mean, my kids were brought up in China, so of course they spoke Mandarin. If you're a parent who lives in Washington State and you don't have a second language at home, you are English, Caucasian speakers, then you'll have to sort of make the decision of what's simply going to make the most sense for your child.
And resources too in your community. Do you know a bunch of neighbors who are maybe immigrants from China or something like this, or a lot of Spanish speakers in your area? Then take advantage of that. Look at what's available to you is sometimes often what dictates what language you get to choose, unfortunately, as well.
Right. And remember that your child is then going to identify with this other culture. They're going to learn how to understand it. They're going to gain cultural competency. And they will see themselves as someone that can extend their life outside of how they've been brought up because of what they're receiving through immersion and instruction. Here's one more really cute story of a little boy that I taught when I was teaching in San Francisco public schools years ago. And he just moved from Japan, where he was in a Japanese school. He was blonde and blue-eyed. And he came home from his first day of school in my kindergarten class and said, "Mom, I'm the only Japanese." So you have to understand that children are really complex and how they see things are complex. So respect that and embrace it.
Interesting story, yeah. So also one more question: how do I choose a quality program?
Oh, so like I mentioned earlier, please, we have some good information about this at Sponge if you'd like to email us about it. But I think, in terms of choosing an instructional-based class, I think you should look for things that are fun and engaging. Go to a trial class if you can. We at Sponge offer trial classes. See what it's like. I think that's the best way to do it. And Sue, what do you think for school-wise if they're trying to choose an immersion school?
Well, I think lots of schools should be really fun and kids should be curious and they should offer more of a democratic, progressive curriculum, period. So if the child is sitting there writing characters 5,000 times during the day, they may then lose their natural interest in learning that language. So you want to look for creativity in language teaching. You want to go visit those classrooms and see what those kids are doing and see how they're using that second language authentically with their peers. Like, that's huge. And make sure, again, the teacher is not breaking those translation rules. Make sure there's lots of evidence of culture, really dynamic culture alive in the classroom, and that not that language majority of English is the one that's always dominated, that there's a really nice balance. And as parents, happy kids when you see them. Kids that are turned off, exactly how that looks. So when you go visit these schools, look for those things. Are they engaged? Are they spontaneous? Is it creative? And does the general atmosphere feel fun and dynamic?
Thank you, Erica and Sue, for answering my questions. And thank you so much for watching this webinar. Like Erica said, if you have any question, you can email us at info@sponschool.com. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Thank you.